Imagine believing you married the man of your dreams, only to discover a devastating secret, living a life of undue luxury. Susan faced this shocking truth, and from then on, everything changed. How did she discover the secret? And what did she do? Find out how this revelation shook their lives and the incredible ending no one expected. You won't believe what happens in the end. Susan looked out the window of the new apartment, watching the bustling city below. She had recently moved in, shortly after marrying Edward, a man she met at a business conference. He seemed the epitome of success and stability, and Susan was eager to start this new chapter of her life by his side. They met during a lecture on innovation in the financial sector. Edward was the keynote speaker, and his confidence and passion for his work were evident. He spoke with authority, captivating everyone present with his visionary ideas. Susan, who was there representing her company, was impressed by his clarity and conviction. After the lecture, there was a cocktail party. Susan, a bit nervous, was holding a glass of wine and trying to relax. She didn't expect to be approached by Edward himself, who walked over with a friendly smile. "Hi, I'm Edward," he said, extending his hand. "Did you enjoy the lecture?" Susan smiled, surprised by his direct and kind approach. "Yes, it was amazing. You really have an inspiring vision for the future." The connection between them was instantaneous. They talked for hours, discovering common interests and sharing dreams and ambitions. Edward was not only successful, he was kind, charismatic, and seemed genuinely interested in Susan. He made her feel special. Susan, who always valued authenticity and hard work, saw in Edward not just a loving partner, but someone with whom she could build a life full of achievements. She envisioned a life of comfort, stability, and love. Edward had a beautiful home in the city, a job he loved, and she thought, "He is perfect, and everything I've ever dreamed of." However, life often surprises us in unexpected ways. Susan was ready for this new life, full of hope and dreams, but what was to come would reveal unexpected challenges and hidden truths. As Susan adjusted to the new city and married life, she began to notice that behind Edward's facade of success was a much more complex and challenging story. What seemed like a fairy tale would soon turn into a journey of discoveries and overcoming obstacles. Each day, Susan learned more about Edward and herself. The life she envisioned with him would be tested in ways she could never have predicted. And so, her journey would be not only one of love and achievements, but also of resilience and profound discoveries about what really matters in life. Susan and Edward were living what seemed like a dream life. Dinners at sophisticated restaurants, international trips to exotic destinations, and glamorous parties were the couple's routine. Susan, always dazzling in her elegant dresses, and Edward, impeccably dressed in expensive suits, were the picture of happiness and success. On one of these nights, they were at one of the city's most renowned restaurants. The soft lights, piano music in the background, and the discreet sound of conversations created the perfect atmosphere. Susan watched Edward, who was as charming as ever, making everyone laugh with his witty stories. "This life is a dream," Susan thought as she held her wine glass. "I have everything I've always wanted." But soon she began to notice small inconsistencies that planted seeds of doubt in her mind. Certain topics seemed uncomfortable for Edward. When she mentioned finances or future plans, he would change the subject or give vague answers. A simple request to review bank documents or discuss investments often resulted in strange reactions, as if he was hiding something. "Susan, you don't need to worry about that. I'll take care of everything," he would say, but there was something in the way he avoided her eyes that made her uneasy. Edward's business trips also became increasingly frequent and mysterious. "Another trip? But you just got back from New York," she questioned, trying to hide her growing frustration. "Yes, dear, but this one is crucial. I promise it will be the last for a while," he responded, kissing her forehead distractedly before leaving through the door. One night, after another glamorous party, Susan stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. Something's not right, she thought. She recalled a specific incident. One night, while alone in the apartment, a letter arrived. It was a notice from a bank. Susan read the letter with a racing heart. But how is this possible? We have enough money, she reflected, feeling a pang of anxiety. Edward entered the bedroom late that night, and she decided to confront him. "Edward, we need to talk. "I received a letter from the bank today," she said, trying to stay calm. He hesitated for a moment before responding. "Oh, that? Don't worry, it must be a misunderstanding. I'll resolve it tomorrow." Despite his reassuring words, Susan could no longer ignore the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The small cracks in the facade of her perfect life were widening, revealing secrets she was not prepared to face. In the following days, Edward continued to avoid serious discussions, and his business trips increased. Susan began to feel that the distance between them was not just physical. She missed the man she met, the one who seemed so open and sincere. "Who are you really, Edward?" Susan thought as she watched the door close once again, with Edward leaving for another mysterious trip. The doubts that haunted her were becoming impossible to ignore, and she knew that eventually she would have to face the truth behind the lies that were beginning to unravel. As the months passed, the feeling that something was wrong became almost unbearable for Susan. She couldn't shake off the growing distrust settling in her heart. Edward continued to avoid certain topics, and his mysterious trips seemed to increase. The tension was always present, like an invisible shadow. One night, after another one of Edward's trips, Susan decided she could no longer ignore her suspicions. While he was in the shower, she went to his office. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the drawer of the desk, finding a pile of disorganized documents. "I need to know the truth," Susan thought, as she began to go through the papers. Her eyes widened as she found notices of overdue payments, maxed-out credit card statements, and bank documents revealing enormous debts. "My God, how is this possible?" She continued searching, finding leasing contracts and loan documents. She discovered that many of the luxuries they enjoyed, the stylish apartment, the sports car, even the designer clothes, were financed or leased. "This can't be happening," she murmured to herself, feeling a wave of panic and betrayal. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle. Edward has been lying to me all this time? When Edward came out of the shower, he found Susan sitting in the office, surrounded by the incriminating documents. He froze in the doorway, his face draining of color. "Susan, I can explain," he began, but his voice was trembling. "Explain what, Edward?" Susan stood up, holding one of the overdue notices. "You lied to me. Why didn't you tell me about this?" He slowly turned his head, his eyes still red from crying. "Talk about what, Edward? About how you lied to me all this time?" He sat down next to her, hesitant. "I understand that you're hurt. I can't justify my lies, but I want you to understand that I was desperate. I was afraid of losing you." Susan took a deep breath, feeling the pain in her chest. "Edward, I love you, but that doesn't mean I can just forget all the lies. You should have trusted me from the start. Instead, you built our relationship on a foundation of deceit." Edward lowered his head, feeling the weight of his actions. "I know, Susan. Each day that passed, I sank deeper into the lies, and the fear of losing you only grew. I never wanted to hurt you." Edward collapsed into a chair, sitting heavily. "I didn't want you to know. I was afraid of losing you," he confessed, his eyes full of tears. Susan felt a mix of anger and sadness. "You should have trusted me. We're a team. Or at least I thought we were. How could you hide this from me?" Edward ran his hands over his face, defeated. "I'm not who you think I am. When we met, I was trying to restart my life. Before that, I lost everything in a failed business venture. I was living on the streets, trying to piece my life back together. Meeting you was like a ray of light in my darkness. I didn't want you to see the mess I really was." Susan sat next to him, feeling the pain in his words. "You should have told me the truth from the beginning. I loved you for the man you are, not for what you have. We can overcome this, but we need to be honest with each other." Susan sat in silence beside Edward, trying to absorb what she had just heard. His words echoed in her mind, each revelation more shocking than the last. She could never have imagined the true extent of Edward's past. "I was born into a wealthy family," Edward began, his voice low and laden with emotion. "My parents were successful investors, and I grew up surrounded by luxury. We had mansions, expensive cars, and everything you could imagine." Susan looked at him, incredulous. "So what happened? How did you lose everything?" Edward sighed deeply, his eyes filled with a sadness he rarely showed. "There was a financial scam, a huge fraud that took everything from my family. My parents invested all their savings in a fund that turned out to be a sham. They lost everything overnight." He paused, struggling to continue. "It was devastating. My father couldn't handle the pressure and died of a heart attack shortly after. My mother fell into depression, and without money for the necessary care, she also passed away soon after. I was left alone, with nothing." Susan felt a lump in her throat as she heard the pain in Edward's voice. "And you? What did you do?" "I had nowhere to go," he replied, looking at the floor. "I lost our house, and without money I ended up on the streets. I lived as a homeless person for years, learning to survive day by day. It was the hardest time of my life. I learned to deal with hunger, cold, and constant fear, and I spent a lot of time in shelters." Susan couldn't hold back her tears. The image of Edward, the confident and successful man she knew, contrasted sharply with the figure of a broken and helpless man, struggling to survive on the streets. "How did you manage to get back on your feet?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "It was a slow and painful process," he explained. "I managed to get some temporary jobs here and there, saving every penny I could, but it was never enough to really get me out of that situation. So, I started creating a facade. I rented a small apartment, bought secondhand clothes that looked expensive, and started attending events where I could make contacts." Susan was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring intently at the wall in front of her. Edward's revelations had devastated her. She felt betrayed, but at the same time, his story of overcoming touched her deeply. The mix of emotions was overwhelming. Edward looked into Susan's eyes, his expression full of regret. "I created a life of lies, all to avoid becoming that man on the streets again. When I met you, I was desperate to keep up that facade. I was afraid of losing you if you knew the truth." Susan felt a whirlwind of emotions. She now understood the depth of Edward's desperation, but she also felt the pain of betrayal. "You should have trusted me. I would have understood. I would have helped you." Edward held her hands, his eyes pleading. "I know. I was so afraid of losing the only good thing that had happened in my life in a long time. But now, I want to be honest with you. With us both. I don't want to live this lie anymore." Susan stopped, looking at him, tears streaming down her face. "I want to believe you, but it's hard. I feel like I'm fighting against two parts of myself. One part wants to forgive you, understand your reasons, but the other part is devastated by the betrayal." Edward stepped forward, holding Susan's hands. "I can't change the past, but I'm here now, willing to do whatever it takes to regain your trust. You mean everything to me, and I don't want to lose you." There was a long silence between them, full of tension and unspoken emotions. Susan knew she needed time to process everything. The love she felt for Edward was real, but the lies had created a difficult barrier to overcome. "We need time to reflect," she finally said, letting go of his hands. "I need to understand my feelings and decide if I can truly forgive you. This won't be easy, Edward. You need to give me space." Edward nodded, though the fear of losing her consumed him. "I understand. I'll give you the time you need. I just want you to know that I'm willing to fight for us, in any way possible." The following days were filled with intense reflection for Susan. She relived every moment, every conversation, trying to separate the lies from the truth. In her solitary walks through the park, she thought about Edward's strength and vulnerability, the pain he carried, and the struggle he faced to rebuild his life. "He's not just a liar," Susan thought. "He's a broken man who desperately tried to build a new life, but can I forgive that?" The nights were long and lonely, each bringing new layers of introspection. Susan knew the decision wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to follow her heart. She knew that true love required more than just words. It required courage, understanding, and above all, the willingness to forgive. Finally, on a cold morning, Susan felt a clarity within herself. "I need to listen to my heart," she thought. "I need to talk to Edward, look into his eyes, and decide our future together." She headed to the office where Edward was sitting, lost in his thoughts. Seeing her enter, he stood up, anxiously waiting for her words. "Edward, I've thought a lot about everything," Susan began, her voice firm but gentle. "I'm willing to try to forgive you, but it's going to take time, honesty, and a lot of effort from both sides. Are we ready for this?" "Edward, with tears in his eyes, nodded. Yes, Susan. I'm ready for whatever it takes. I love you more than anything in this world, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to regain your trust. With the decision to rewrite their future together, Susan and Edward began a journey of redemption and growth that required courage, honesty, and a renewed commitment to the truth. Susan, determined to leave behind false appearances, encouraged Edward to face his insecurities and start over, this time authentically. The first major change came when they decided to tackle their debts. "We need to face this head-on," said Susan, as they sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by piles of papers and spreadsheets. "We have to be honest about our financial situation and make a plan to get out of this hole." Edward nodded, feeling a mix of shame and relief. "I know it's going to be hard, but I'm ready to face this with you. I don't want to live a life of lies anymore." They sold the luxurious apartment and the possessions they couldn't afford, moving to a more modest but cozy place. "This is where we start over," said Susan, looking around the new apartment. "It doesn't matter where we are, as long as we're together and honest with each other." Edward started working 2 jobs, striving to pay off the accumulated debts. "I never thought I'd be back to such a simple job," he confessed one night, exhausted after a long day. "But there's something comforting in knowing I'm building something real this time." Susan held his hand, looking deeply into his eyes. "I'm proud of you, Edward. We're doing this together, and that's what matters." As they paid off their debts and built a new life, Edward also decided to face his past in another way. He began spending more time in the community where he had been homeless, using his experiences to help others in similar situations. One afternoon, he and Susan walked to the local shelter where Edward had spent many difficult days. "It feels strange to be back here," he admitted, taking a deep breath. "But I think this is where I need to be." Susan smiled, proud of her husband. "You have a powerful story to share. You can really make a difference in these people's lives." Edward began working as a volunteer at the shelter, offering financial and emotional advice to the residents. "I know what it's like to lose everything," he would tell the men and women who listened attentively. "But I also know it's possible to rise again. Don't give up on yourselves." He reconnected with old acquaintances, those who were still struggling to survive on the streets. "You're back, Ed," said one of them, a man named Jack, who had been his companion in misfortune. "I never thought I'd see you here again, but this time with a light in your eyes." "I'm here to help, Jack," Edward replied, emotional. "If I could get out of this, any of you can too." Edward's impact on the community was profound. He was not just a former homeless person, but a living example that redemption and growth were possible. Susan, by his side, also got involved, offering classes on practical and emotional skills to help those in need rebuild their lives. "We are rebuilding our lives, but we are also helping others rebuild theirs," Susan said at a community event. "That's what really matters." Over time, Edward and Susan not only paid off their debts, but also created a life filled with meaning and purpose. They turned adversity into strength and falsehood into authenticity. Together, they were stronger than ever, ready to face any challenge life might present. As they walked hand in hand through the park, Edward looked at Susan with gratitude. "You gave me a second chance, Susan. A chance to be a better man, a true man." Susan and Edward's life was becoming more authentic and true, but the real turning point was about to happen. Susan knew that Edward was dedicating himself to helping those in difficult situations, but she had no idea of the depth of the impact he had already made. One afternoon, while returning from work, Susan decided to make a surprise visit to the shelter where Edward spent so much time. Upon arrival, she was greeted with warm smiles and affectionate greetings. "You must be Susan," said an elderly woman, who was stacking boxes of donated clothes. "Edward talks a lot about you." Susan smiled, touched by the reception. "Yes, that's me. I came to see how things are going here." As she walked through the shelter, she noticed how people looked at Edward with respect and admiration. Curious, she approached a group that was listening attentively as Edward spoke. "When I was on the streets, I learned that the most important thing is never to lose hope," Edward was saying. "There were times when I thought I wouldn't make it, but the people here helped me keep going. Now it's my turn to help you." Susan watched in silence, noticing the expressions of the listeners. There was gratitude, respect, and a deep connection that she had not fully understood before. After the talk, a man named Miguel approached her. "You're a lucky woman," said Miguel, his face serious but kind. "Edward is a rare man. When he was on the streets, he always shared the little he had. He inspired us to keep going, even when everything seemed lost." Susan felt a wave of emotions hearing this. I knew he had a good heart, but I had no idea how much he had already helped others. Miguel nodded, looking at Edward with admiration. "He's a true leader. His generosity and compassion gave us hope in dark times. Many people here owe a lot to him." She continued to talk to others in the shelter, hearing stories about how Edward had helped save lives, offering advice, emotional support, and even his last coins to buy food for someone more in need than himself. Each story was a testament to Edward's true wealth and humanity. That night, back at the apartment, Susan was thoughtful. "Edward, today I discovered something incredible about you," she began, holding his hands. "People at the shelter respect you deeply. You have touched so many lives with your generosity and compassion." Edward smiled, but there was humility in his eyes. "I did what anyone would do, Susan. When you're on the streets, you realize we're all in the same boat. Helping others was the only thing that made sense." Susan felt her heart fill with love and admiration. "You've always been more than just a man trying to restart his life. You're an example of true humanity, someone who found wealth not in material possessions, but in acts of kindness and compassion." Edward squeezed Susan's hands, emotional. "Everything I did because I knew one day I wanted to build a life with you, a life based on truth and love. I never imagined my story could touch so many lives." Susan gently kissed his hands. "We have something more precious than any material wealth. We have the respect and gratitude of the people we've helped, and that is the true wealth." With this new understanding, Susan and Edward felt more united than ever. They had not only overcome their financial challenges, but also created a legacy of compassion and humanity. The turning point was not just a change in their circumstances, but a profound realization that, together, they could make a difference in the world. She smiled, squeezing his hand. "And you showed me that true love can overcome any obstacle. We're just beginning, Edward. The future awaits us." With the promise of a new beginning and an unwavering commitment to the truth, Susan and Edward were ready for the next chapter of their lives, knowing that together they could face anything. And so, armed with this new strength and clarity, Susan and Edward were ready to face the future, knowing that true wealth lies in the impact they have on others and in the love and respect they share. In our journey, we've seen how appearances can be deceiving, and how living a life based on falsehoods can lead to a devastating downfall. Susan and Edward taught us that true wealth is not in luxury, but in the small things: honesty, mutual support, and the strength of genuine love. It is in adversity that we find our true worth, and in authentic relationships, we discover true happiness. Have you ever stopped to think about how often we judge people by appearances without knowing their true stories? How do you deal with challenges and difficult truths in your life? If you enjoyed this inspiring story, like the video, and follow our channel for more stories of overcoming and true love. Leave your comment below sharing your opinion or a similar experience. We want to hear from you. Together, we can learn and grow, valuing what really matters.